Naylin stood in the doorway of the sod shanty that had become her unexpected prison and her sanctuary. The heat of the day was already rising, a tangible weight that pressed against her skin and made the horizon dance in a blur of brown and gold. She smoothed the skirt of her light blue prairie dress, a garment that had once been the color of a clear spring sky, but was now dusted with the relentless gray powder of the territory. She had arrived here 3 months ago, clutching a letter from a husband-to-be she had never met, a man who had promised her a new life away from the smoke and noise of the coast. But when the wagon train rolled on, he was not there to meet her at the outpost. The station master had simply shaken his head, spat on the ground, and told her the man had died of the fever 2 weeks prior. With no money for a return ticket and too much pride to beg, she had taken shelter in this abandoned dugout miles from the nearest town, trading her labor for meager supplies from passing travelers. She was small, perhaps, and looked as fragile as a porcelain doll to the rough men who rode by, but her spine was made of steel, and her hands knew the language of work. On this particular morning, the silence of the plains was broken, not by the usual coyote or hawk, but by a sound distinctively human, a low, guttural groan of pain drifting from the dry creek bed to the west. Maylin paused, her hand hovering over the water bucket. Fear was a constant companion out here for a woman alone, but curiosity and a deeply ingrained sense of duty pulled her forward. She grabbed a sturdy branch she used for walking and stepped out into the blazing sun. The heat radiated from the ground, penetrating the thin soles of her shoes. She followed the sound, the dry grass crunching beneath her feet, until she reached the lip of the ravine. There, tangled in the roots of a fallen cottonwood, lay a man. He was covered in the dust of the trail, his hat knocked askew, and his face pale beneath a layer of grit and sweat. He looked like death warmed over, but he was alive. Maylin scrambled down the embankment, her blue dress catching on the thorny scrub brush. The man was large, broad-shouldered, and dressed in heavy denim and leather that spoke of long days in the saddle. But it was his left leg that drew her eye. The boot was swollen tight, and a dark, ominous stain had seeped through the leather near the ankle. He had clearly taken a bad fall, perhaps thrown by a horse that was nowhere to be seen. She knelt beside him, her shadow falling over his face. He flinched, his hand instinctively grasping for the holster at his hip, but his fingers were too weak to find the purchase. His eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of stormy seas, clouded now with agony and fever. "Easy," she whispered, the word feeling strange on her tongue after days of silence. "I am here. I will help." He squinted at her, trying to make sense of the angel in the faded blue prairie dress hovering over him in the middle of nowhere. He tried to speak, his voice a raspy croak, but his head lolled back against the dirt, the pain dragging him back into darkness. Maylin knew she could not leave him here. The sun would kill him before the wolves came out. Moving a man of his size was a task that would have daunted a mule, let alone a slight woman who had subsisted on hardtack and wild onions for weeks. Maylin assessed the situation with the pragmatic eye of a survivor. She could not carry him, that much was certain. She would have to drag him, inch by painful inch, out of the ravine and toward the shade of her dugout. She hurried back to the shanty and returned with a tanned buffalo hide she used as a rug, a discarded treasure she had found weeks ago. It took all her strength to roll him onto the hide. The man groaned, a sound of pure misery, but he did not wake. Maylin tied the corners of the hide to her waist with a length of rope, channeling the strength of her ancestors, the women who had carried burdens across mountains and oceans. The journey back to the dugout was less than a quarter of a mile, but it felt like crossing a continent. The sun beat down with a hammer's force. Sweat ran into Maylin's eyes, stinging and blurring her vision. Every few yards she had to stop, gasping for breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She would look back at the man, watching the rise and fall of his chest to ensure he was still with her. He remained unconscious, a mercy given the jarring movement of the drag. The dust swirled around them, coating her blue dress until it looked gray, turning her raven hair into a powdered wig. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, one step, then another. Pull, rest. Pull, rest. It was a mantra of survival. She thought of the stories her mother told her, of the great ox who carried the world on its back. She felt like that ox now, burdened but unbreaking. When they finally reached the cool, earthen interior of the dugout, Maylin collapsed on the floor, her lungs burning. But there was no time to rest. She crawled to the water barrel, filled a tin cup, and wetted the man's lips. He sputtered, coughing weakly, and instinct kicked in. She needed to get that boot off. The leather was so swollen around the injury it looked as if it had fused to his skin. She produced a small, sharp knife she used for peeling roots. With steady hands, she began to cut the leather, slicing through the expensive stitching. The man shifted, a low growl escaping his throat as the pressure released. When the boot fell away, Maylin hissed in sympathy. The ankle was an angry shade of purple and blue, the skin hot to the touch, and there was a jagged gash that looked infected. It wasn't a break, or if it was, the infection was the more immediate danger. The smell of sickness rose from the wound, sharp and metallic. She worked quickly, boiling water over the small fire she kept banked in the corner stove. She tore strips from her only other petticoat, sacrificing the fabric without a second thought. She had no medicine, no doctor's salves, but she had the old ways. She went to her small store of dried herbs, sage for cleansing, and a poultice she had made from chewed willow bark and mud. As she cleaned the wound, the man's eyes snapped open again. This time there was clarity in them, sharp and defensive. He tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp. Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough like gravel sliding down a hill. "Where am I?" Maylin did not flinch. She continued to dab the hot water around the angry gash. "You are safe," she said simply. "I found you in the dry creek. Your foot is bad. You must lie still." He watched her, his eyes narrowing, scanning the humble room, the dirt floor, the single wooden chair, the lack of any valuables. He seemed to be calculating something, a habit of a man who has much to lose. The afternoon stretched out, long and languid, the heat outside turning the world into a furnace while the dugout remained bearably cool. The man, whose name was Colton, though he didn't offer it immediately, watched Maylin with a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment. He was used to people knowing who he was. As the owner of the Double Barquet, the largest cattle operation in the territory, he was accustomed to deference, to people rushing to aid him in hopes of a reward or a favor. But this woman, with her quiet grace and her tattered blue dress, seemed to have no idea that the man bleeding on her floor could buy the entire county 10 times over. To her, he was just another broken thing that needed mending. He decided, in that moment of vulnerability, to keep his secret. If she knew his wealth, the dynamic would change. She might ask for money, or worse, she might fear him. And right now, stripped of his horse and his men, helpless on a stranger's floor, he found he didn't want to be the wealthy rancher. He just wanted to be a man who was being cared for. "I don't have much to pay you with," Colton lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He watched her face closely for a reaction, a flicker of disappointment or anger. "I'm just a hand drifting between jobs. Horse threw me and ran off with my kit." Maylin paused in her work, looking up from the poultice she was applying. Her dark eyes were unreadable pools of calm. "I did not ask for payment," she said softly, her voice carrying a lilt that softened the hard edges of the frontier dialect. "We are all drifters here, are we not? The land owns us. We do not own the land." She tied off the bandage with a gentle firmness. Rest now. The fever is in you. If you talk, you use strength you do not have." Colton felt a strange pang in his chest, one that had nothing to do with the throbbing in his foot. It had been a long time since anyone had told him what to do without fear of retribution. He laid his head back on the rough pillow he had fashioned from a grain sack, listening to the soft swish-swish of her dress as she moved about the room, tidying a space that contained almost nothing. As twilight began to bleed into the sky, painting the plains in bruised shades of purple and orange, the temperature finally began to drop. The relief was physical, a loosening of the tension that held the world together during the scorching hours. Maylin built up the fire, the smell of burning sagebrush filling the small space, a scent that was sharp, clean, and wild. She prepared a broth from dried beef and wild onions, the aroma savory and comforting. She helped Colton sit up, propping him against the wall. He was weak, his face flushed with the heat of the infection, but the rest seemed to have steadied him. He took the tin cup from her hands, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against her smooth, slender ones. The contrast was stark. The hand of a man who broke horses and built empires, and the hand of a woman who mended and endured. "You have a name, ma'am?" he asked, blowing on the steam rising from the cup. "I reckon I can't keep calling you Angel in my head." A ghost of a smile touched Maylin's lips, fleeting and shy. "I am Maylin," she said. "And you?" Colton hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Colt," he said, giving the shortened version his friends used, the name that didn't carry the weight of his family's legacy. "Just Colt." He took a sip of the broth. It was simple fare, peasant food, but to his starving belly it tasted better than the steak dinners served at the cattlemen's club in the city. "You live here alone, Maylin?" he asked, glancing around the empty room again. "It's a hard place for a woman on her own." Maylin sat on the wooden crate that served as her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the high cheekbones and the sadness that lingered in the corners of her eyes. "I wait," she said, her gaze turning toward the dark square of the window. "My husband, he was to meet me. He did not come." She paused, and Colton saw her throat work as she swallowed a lump of grief. "They say he is gone, but until I know where to go, I stay. This roof has no holes. The spring is nearby. It is enough." Colton felt a heavy stone of guilt settle in his gut. He knew the harsh reality of this country. Men died, women were left stranded, and the world moved on without a backward glance. He looked at this woman, wearing a dress meant for a wedding or a church social, now worn while nursing a stranger in a dirt hovel. She had saved his life, dragged him through the heat, and fed him her own food, all while believing he was a penniless drifter who could offer her nothing in return. The night deepened, and the coyotes began their chorus, a series of yips and howls that usually made the hair on Colton's neck stand up. But tonight, with the fire crackling and Maylin humming a low, mournful tune as she mended a tear in her sleeve, the wildness outside felt distant. However, the peace was fragile. Late in the night, Colton woke with a start, his body shaking violently. The fever had spiked. His teeth chattered, and his leg felt as though it were being held in a bonfire. Maylin was there instantly, her cool hand on his forehead. "You burn," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. She checked the water bucket. It was dangerously low. They had used much of it to clean the wound and for the broth. "I must get more water," she said, grabbing the bucket. "No," Colton rasped, gripping her wrist weakly. "Not at night. The wolves." His eyes were wild, the delirium setting in. "Don't go." Maylin gently pried his fingers loose. "If I do not cool you, the fever will take your mind. I will be quick." She stood up, looking small against the encroaching shadows. She took the heavy pistol from his holster, checking the cylinder with a competence that surprised him, and stepped out into the dark. Colton watched the door close, his heart hammering in his chest, realizing with a terrifying clarity that his life, and perhaps his heart, was entirely in the hands of this forgotten bride. He lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years that she would return. The minutes stretched into hours in his fevered mind, each second a judgment on his deception and his helplessness. He vowed then, in the delirium of the heat, that if she walked back through that door, he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay a debt that money couldn't touch. The silence that followed the closing of the door was heavier than the sod roof above Colton's head. It was a silence that pressed against his eardrums, filled only by the thudding of his own frantic heart and the distant, lonely whistle of the wind through the buffalo grass. Time seemed to warp in the heat of his fever, stretching minutes into hours, and every shadow in the corner of the room began to take the shape of a specter waiting to claim him. He strained his ears, listening for the crack of a twig or the blast of the pistol, but the night held its secrets close. Just as he was about to drag himself off the pallet, convinced she had been taken by the wolves or the darkness itself, the latch lifted. Maylin slipped back inside, breathless and shivering, the water bucket sloshing against her leg. She bolted the door with a trembling hand, and even in the dim light of the dying fire, Colton could see the terror etched into her face. She didn't speak of what she had seen or heard out there in the void. She simply set the bucket down, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle, and knelt beside him. She soaked a rag in the fresh, cool water that had cost her a risk he couldn't fully comprehend, and pressed it to his burning neck. The sensation was shocking, a jolt of ice against the fire in his blood, and he let out a long, ragged breath. For the rest of that night she did not sleep. She was a sentinel in a faded blue dress, fighting the fever with nothing but patience and well water, wringing out the cloth again and again until the gray light of dawn finally began to bleed through the cracks in the wall. When the sun finally rose, turning the dust motes into floating gold, Colton's fever broke. He woke to find her slumped against the crate, asleep at last, her hand still resting protectively near the poultice on his ankle. The days that followed drifted by in a haze of slow healing and quiet observation. The dugout, which had first seemed like a grave, began to feel like the only honest place in the world. Colton's strength returned in increments, measured by how long he could sit up or how much weight he could put on his heel without seeing stars. He spent his time watching Maylin. He watched her battle the dust that sought to bury them, sweeping the earthen floor with a broom made of twigs. He watched her ration the food, realizing with a sinking gut that the portions she gave him were twice the size of her own. She never complained, never asked him for a promised reward, and never probed into his past. She simply existed in a state of grace, doing what needed to be done. It humbled him. He was a man who owned 40,000 head of cattle and land that stretched from the jagged peaks in the north to the salt flats in the south. Yet he had never known a dignity like this. One afternoon, while she was mending a tear in his shirt, he decided to test the waters, guilt gnawing at him like a rat. "You ever think about leaving this place, Maylin?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Go to the city? Find a new start?" She paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. "To go requires means," she answered softly, her eyes fixed on the work. "And to go alone is to be prey. Here I am hidden. The land is harsh, yes, but it is honest. It does not promise what it cannot give." Colton looked at his hands, calloused and empty. He could give her the means. He could give her a ticket to anywhere, or a house with glass windows and a garden. But the words stuck in his throat. He was afraid that if he revealed himself as the cattle baron, the delicate trust they had built would shatter, replaced by the deference and distance he despised. So he remained Colt, the drifter, and let the lie sit between them like an invisible wall. By the 5th day, the supply of dried beef was gone. Mei Lin served him a soup that was little more than hot water and wild onions, apologizing quietly for the lack of substance. Colton ate it without a word, but his resolve hardened. He couldn't let her starve for his pride. He was formulating a plan to sneak away in the night, walk the 10 miles to his nearest line shack, and return with a wagon full of supplies, when the sound of approaching thunder rolled across the plains. But the sky was clear and blue. Colton froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. That wasn't thunder. It was the rhythmic, pounding beat of hooves, many of them. Mei Lin heard it too. She stood up, her face draining of color, and moved instinctively to the corner where the pistol lay. "Riders," she whispered, the word heavy with dread. "Stay down, Colt. Do not make a sound." She was preparing to defend him again, this small woman against a group of unknown men. The hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just outside the dugout. The creak of saddle leather and the jingle of spurs drifted through the heavy wooden door. A voice, loud and commanding, boomed out. "Hello, the house! We're looking for a lost rider. Tracks lead this way." Colton's heart hammered, not with fear but with recognition. It was Jace, his foreman, a man as loyal as a hound but rough as a cob. Mei Lin raised the pistol with both hands, aiming it at the door, her whole body trembling but her feet planted firm. She looked back at Colton, her eyes fierce. "I will not let them take you," she vowed. Colton knew the game was up. He couldn't let her fire on his own men, and he couldn't let Jace kick the door in and frighten her further. He pushed himself up, ignoring the protest of his healing ankle, and limped toward her. "Mei Lin," he said, his voice low and steady, "put the gun down." She looked at him, confused, panic flaring in her eyes. "No, they will hurt you," she hissed. "Trust me," he said, and for the first time he used the tone he reserved for the ranch, a tone of absolute authority. He reached out and gently took the heavy weapon from her shaking hands. Then he turned to the door and shouted, "Jace, you kick that door in, and I'll dock your pay for a year." The silence outside was instantaneous. Then a bewildered voice replied, "Boss?" Colton unbolted the door and threw it open. The blinding afternoon light poured in, illuminating the stunned faces of 5 cowboys mounted on sweating horses. They looked from the dusty, bearded man in the doorway to the terrified woman in the blue dress standing behind him. Jace swept his hat off his head, his jaw hanging loose. "Lord almighty, boss, we thought you were dead in a ditch somewhere. We've been combing the territory for a week." Colton leaned against the doorframe, the pain in his foot throbbing, but he stood tall. "Not dead," he said dryly. "Just detained." He turned to look at Mei Lin. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, the realization washing over her in a slow, painful wave. The drifter. The hand who had nothing. The man she had starved to feed. He was the boss. He was the power in this valley. The betrayal on her face hit Colton harder than the fall from his horse had. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply took a step back, her hands retreating into the folds of her dirty blue dress, and turned her face away. The intimacy of the dugout, the shared struggle, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a chasm of class and deceit. Colton turned back to his men, his voice hard. "Jace, get down. We need supplies, and I need a horse that rides double." He limped back into the room, approaching Mei Lin slowly, as one would approach a frightened deer. "Mei Lin," he started, "I didn't tell you because—" He stopped. Every excuse sounded hollow. "I wanted to be sure," he finished lamely. "Sure of what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, not looking at him. "That I would not sell you for a coin? That I was worth saving?" She looked up then, and her eyes were filled with tears she refused to shed. "You have played a game, sir, and I was the board." Colton flinched. "No game," he said earnestly. "You saved my life. You gave me the last of your food when you thought I couldn't pay for it. That means more to me than every acre I own." He reached into his pocket, but there was nothing there. He realized with a start that he had nothing to offer her in this moment but the truth. "I can't undo the lie," he said, "but I can offer you a truth. You don't have to stay in this hole in the ground. You don't have to wait for a dead man or fear the winter." He held out his hand, the same hand she had held when the fever burned him. "Come with me," he said, "not as a servant, not as a charity case. Come as the woman who saved the owner of the Double Bar K. My home is large, Maylin, but it is empty. It has needed kindness for a long time." The men outside were silent, listening to the wind and the drama unfolding in the sod shanty. Maylin looked at his hand, then at the meager possessions she had gathered, the crate, the bucket, the buffalo hide. She looked at the walls that had been her prison and her shelter. Then she looked at the man. She saw the wealth now and the way he stood, but she also saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that she would refuse him, that she would choose her pride over his offer. She realized that while he might own the land, in this room she held the power. She took a breath, smoothed her prairie dress, and made her choice. She did not take his hand immediately. Instead, she walked to the stove, picked up the small bag of herbs she had used to heal him, and tied it to her belt. It was a gesture that said she was bringing herself, her skills, and her worth with her. Only then did she turn to him. "I will come," she said with quiet dignity, "but I ride my own horse, if you have one." Colton grinned, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in years. "Jace," he yelled, "bring up the roan mare, gentle as a lamb." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of violent violet and burning orange, the small cavalcade moved out across the plains. They left the sod dugout behind, a small mound of earth that would soon be reclaimed by the grass and the wind. Colton rode beside Maylin, matching his pace to hers. They didn't speak much. There would be time for words later, for explanations and apologies, and perhaps, in the fullness of time, for something softer and sweeter to grow from the roots of this strange meeting. For now there was only the rhythm of the horses, the smell of sagebrush, and the vast, open promise of the west. He watched her profile against the sunset, her chin held high, no longer the forgotten bride, but a woman riding toward a destiny she had carved out with her own 2 hands. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale. My grandmother always said that you can tell the measure of a person not by how they treat a king, but by how they treat a beggar. Maylin didn't save a rich rancher. She saved a fellow human being, and in doing so, she saved herself. It's a funny thing about kindness. It's the only investment that never fails. You cast your bread upon the waters, and sometimes, just sometimes, it comes back to you as a feast. As you sit by your fire tonight, remember that everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, and the stranger at your gate might just hold the key to your own salvation. Be kind, be brave, and keep your heart open to the surprises of Providence. Good night, and may your own road be blessed.